Hey viewers, I'm Michael Johnson, and beside me here, weighing in at over 150 pounds, are the flagship speakers from the Finnish brand Amphion, the Krypton3X. Despite their massive size, Amphion claim this is one of the most room-friendly, full-range speakers on the market. And as this marks my first review in my new trailside basement listening room, that's the hypothesis I aim to test in this video. So, what are the Krypton3X? Well, they're a three-way, full-range, floor-standing speaker designed and built in Finland. The Krypton3X come in white, black, and walnut finishes and are priced at $30,000 in the US market. Yeah, folks, we're firmly in the high end here. Amphion claim a frequency response of 21 Hz to 55 kHz, which is achieved with a driver configuration consisting of a 1-inch titanium tweeter set inside a waveguide, and then two 8-inch ribbed mid-range drivers made of papyrus, which I discovered conducting this review is a real material and not just a font. Papyrus was predominantly used for paper in ancient Egypt, but the plant is still around today, harvested in Africa, although it's a bit of a niche market. Finally, on the side of the speaker sits a 10-inch side-firing aluminum cone woofer. The mid-range drivers of the speaker are vented in a cardioid design, and that's apparent when you view this cabinet from the side. This is the design Amphion used to reduce dispersion of the driver to the rear and side of the cabinet. The results of this design, in theory, is to reduce room reflections on the rear and side walls, especially when it comes to the mid-range. On the rear of the cabinet, there are two dual-firing bass ports, and they handle the bass reflex from both the mid-range drivers and from the side-firing woofer. I think the crossover design of the Krypton3X deserves some mention. It's a little different than the normal crossover. It uses a series network rather than a parallel network. Parallel networks are very common, much more common in speaker design, and involve splitting the signal path and filtering it individually for each driver. A series crossover is very different. It does not split the signal path, but rather each driver is wired together in a series with individual capacitors and inductors filtering out the frequencies for each driver. The traditional pros of the parallel network is that it is great for isolation, driver control, and phase. A series crossover, on the other hand, in theory, it can generate a much flatter frequency response and coherence of sound across each driver. Series crossovers they're a tricky technology, and it requires a lot of expense and effort to design one effectively because it's much harder to control unwanted driver resonance and things like that with this type of crossover. The frequency specs of the crossover are also kind of interesting, as the tweeter crosses off kind of low at 1600 Hz, while the 10-inch woofer crosses off at a much more usual 160 Hz. Amphion specify a recommended amplifier power of 100 to 300 watts per channel with a nominal impedance rating of 4 ohms. When Amphion first shipped these speakers to me, I was still living in my old one-bedroom apartment that you've probably seen in my previous reviews for this magazine. And when I heard about floor standards that were room-friendly in a variety of spaces, that's how it was pitched to me, I went, yeah, sure, I can try that. And then these two huge 200-pound crates arrived, and I quickly reassessed and decided that these would have to wait until my new listening room was finished just to give them a fair shake. So now, here we are. I paired the Krypton3X with my reference system, which as it stands now includes the Hagel H30 power amplifier and Baccarat Labs Roomba Extreme 1.2 tube preamplifier. My analog source is the Hana Umami Red cartridge. It's mounted on a Pure Fidelity Horizon turntable paired with an Alnic H1202 phono stage. Digital is handled by an EOS Zenith Mark III streamer, Oppo 105D transport, and Denafrips Pontus 2 DAC. I ran the Amphions with a pair of transparent Super Gen 6 speaker cables. I thought these were the best match for a full-range speaker like this. And after a bit of time setting up and tuning my room, which this room sits at around 17 feet by 25 feet with 9-foot ceilings, I felt pretty confident that I had the Kryptons in a room that was a little more average for the type of space these speakers would likely wind up in. Look. This listening room, while I'm proud of it, is nowhere near the fully custom designed acoustic space of some like our host Tom Martin, and his in-depth video on room setup and acoustics is definitely worth checking out. Mine is not nearly that in-depth, but with some diffusion and bass traps in place, coupled with a relatively low propensity for resonance in this room because it has a concrete floor, I felt pretty good about the sound I was getting with both my personal speakers and the Amphions. In this space, I ended up with the speakers about 9 feet apart, and they're 4 feet from the back and side walls, and just under 12 feet from my listening position. It's not quite a perfect triangle, but I thought it was more than acceptable in setup for my ears, and keeping with the theme of this speaker that claims to be somewhat unfussy on placement. There are, however, two decisions in placement that I found made a very large difference with the Krypton3X. One is the woofer placement. The side-firing 10-inch woofers on this speaker can either be placed inwards or outwards. Amphion state that in the vast majority of situations, they set them up with the woofers facing each other in towards the center of the soundstage. However, they suggest that if you want to place the woofers outside, you can do that and potentially get a much wider soundstage. Now, it's one thing to suggest experimenting with placement if you're not the one moving 150 pounds of speaker on carpet spikes, but after a little bit of elbow grease, I did try the Kryptons in the woofer out configuration. Soundstage was bigger, but less focused, and I felt like there was less body from the mid-range, just all the way on down. I really preferred the woofer in setup. In the afternoon I spent comparing and stuck with that placement for the rest of the review because I didn't want to move these things anymore. Another area that really made a huge difference on this speaker was toe-in. I started with the speakers toed in. A good deal is that's how I liked my reference Harbeths in this space. However, I immediately realized my mistake and started towing the speakers back out until they're pretty much almost parallel with just a tiny bit of toe-in. Toed in, these speakers were way too forward, particularly in the lower treble, and it made them kind of uncrankable. Sitting just shy of parallel was a completely different experience, and my guess is that's where you're going to want to start with the Krypton3X. In fact, I would start with them completely parallel, and if you really want to focus in the inner soundstage, then start towing them in a little, but I would start with them facing out. With the stated frequency response going down into the low 20s, this is the first full-range speaker I've had the opportunity to review. I've usually relied on subs to provide the low end that couldn't be reached by the speakers that traditionally have fit in my formerly smaller listening space, but it's not a problem really in this room and not a problem with these speakers, and I was eager to test the bass response of the Amphion Krypton3Xs. I brought up my old subwoofer test playlist and pulled a few tracks that I thought had impressive bass characteristics. One of those is, of course, Electrified by Boris Blanc. This track on the Kryptons, it surprised me because on the one hand, I could really hear deep, articulate bass coming from this speaker. But it didn't shake the floors or rattle the walls, and that's when I began my journey to understanding kind of what this speaker was doing and what type of listener it was for. In Electrified, the bass was certainly present, but it didn't dominate the sound I was hearing. Instead, I heard kind of a detailed tapestry of every little electronic effect spread wide and deep across the soundstage in front of me. In particular, I was focused deeply on how much more of the high percussion texture I was hearing. The thump of the bass was an effect, but it wasn't the main course this speaker was serving up. It didn't present the most emotional, danceable rendition of Electrified I've heard, but what it did allow me to do is to focus on the music of the song. In this rendition of Electrified, I think Boris traded his Ray-Bans and cigarette for a dinner jacket. That's how I heard it on the Amphions. I also streamed music that wasn't on my list of test tracks, but nevertheless, on previous equipment, previous systems yielded good sound. And you know, there is that minor detail of this hobby called musical enjoyment. Unless, of course, you sit around with your glass of wine listening to test tracks on your night off, in which case there's clearly something else going on there, and you should probably call your family. I think they're worried about you. Anyway, Comment Fou by Quebecois band Harmonium is one of my favorite progressive rock tracks, and it's a magical adventure through the mind and vocal range of lead songwriter Serge Fiori. I was used to this track and album sounding pretty juicy and satisfying in its own kind of mid-70s way. But what I was discovering about the Krypton3X is that despite their unfussy placement, they had sophisticated musical tastes. What I mean is that they were unabashed truth tellers. I started hearing all these problems in the recording that I think I used to ignore either willfully or unconsciously. Now, this isn't the first time I've been caught with the honest truth about a recording that I thought passed audiophile muster until I heard it on a truly revealing system. I remember having a similar experience visiting PS Audio's Boulder showroom way back in 2022 and hearing the then brand new Aspen FR30 speakers. Yes, they did blow me away, but they made the difference in recording so palpable that it simply almost ruined some albums for me, and I deleted a couple songs off my reference playlist that day from that demonstration. Does that mean that the Amphion Krypton3X made Harmonium sound bad? Well, no, although compared to Boris Blanc, I think it sure did. But I think I was just made audibly aware at how different various recordings could be. And for someone hunting recording quality, this is definitely a speaker that I think rewards that endeavor. But okay, going back to Comment Fou. There were things about the presentation I could definitely get engrossed by. Things like the breathiness of Serge's vocals, particularly his head voice and his falsetto. I also, I reveled in the sound of the acoustic instruments littering the soundstage. I mean, this is a big kind of orchestral prog rock album. It has got flute, it's got piano, it's got all these acoustic instruments that really sounded fluorescent and open and with lots of space around them. But what was missing for me were things like the body of the electric guitar or that juicy, wiggly mid-range of the analog keyboards. Those instruments were present, but they didn't fill my listening space the way like the vocals or the drums did, which made me think that these speakers maybe don't have a lot of like significant presence in the mid-range. But to really understand high-end equipment like this for myself and my ears, streaming doesn't cut it, and I gotta play a lot of records. And I certainly did. I truly enjoyed hearing this new nuance I was picking up out of my record collection. It was actually a fun game to play. Does this record sound as good as I remember it sounding? Well, some discs fared better than others. One clear winner was this 1978 art pop album, Tokimeki by Akiko Yano on Philips Records. This record has one of the best, most natural kick drum punches I've ever heard on vinyl, and the beauty of a speaker like this is that on this record, that punch was definitely there. It hit low, it hit hard, it hit fast. Particularly listening to the opening track, Children. But what was so amazing about listening to this track on this speaker is the bass didn't take away the focus of the song. It didn't blur any of the information in the rest of the stereo image and the rest of the frequency range. In fact, the upper electronics had a lot of zing to them, and it was fun picking out the little keyboard effects Yano littered her instrumentation with at this point in her career. Because, you know, this record was made as she was starting to move away from the jazz rock she made in the 70s into synth pop that she would do a lot of in the 1980s. Other records I played that, you know, I could really hear the full range nature of this speaker. You know, I pulled out my original UK copy of XTC's English Settlement, and this record is cut with really, really, really deep full bass. And on some systems, that bass can be overwhelming. Here on these speakers, I heard it down into the 20s. It was remarkable. It was full, it was punchy. I listened to No Thugs in Our House, which is the big single off this record, and it was so engaging and so exciting. But on many speakers I've listened to, or if I listen to this track with subs, that bass can kind of overwhelm the song, overwhelm the soundstage, and it didn't do that here. Everything else was really detailed, really clear, really apparent, really balanced. And so if you have records with bass that's very, very controlled and well engineered, man, this speaker brings that out. Very exciting to listen to. But, you know, then I moved on to something that I really wanted to listen to for fun, and that was, you know, Rush's Farewell to Kings. the original US pressing, and this kind of disappointed me. The sound was anemic, the bass was papery, the rock and roll effects, the distortion of the guitar, the shine of the guitar, it did kind of sound boxed in and narrow and not full-bodied, not energetic, and that's because just the mix was not mixed to be as audiophiles engaging as like the XTC record or the Kiko Yano record. And that's something I had to come to terms with when listening on the Amphion. It's just, it wasn't happy with everything I fed it. Playing something with a bit more air and space, I did move to put on this mono cut, Sam Records cut of Chet Baker Quintet and Bobby Jasper. Once I got to track 2, once in a while, I was listening really intently to the placement of players in front of me. With the bass drivers on the Amphions pointed inward, this speaker can do a really great job of creating a solid image, mostly in the middle. It's very important in a mono record like this one. Mono creates a narrower presentation, but I found when listening on a true high-end setup, even a mono mix can create layering in the illusion of space that is three-dimensional, including even some space left-right. The Krypton absolutely did that, all while making Chet's trumpet ring very clearly, very textured across my space. Finally, I played a new reissue from Deutsche Gramophone's original Source series, Carlo Maria Giulini conducting the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. So this recording was done in Chicago's Medina Temple across the street from Symphony Hall, and the space sounds vastly different from Symphony Hall, where a lot of this orchestra's famous recordings were done in the 1950s and 1960s. This was done later in the 70s. This recording, it hides nothing, especially through this original Source version. It's an exercise in clarity. The clarity is in the sound of the instruments, but also in their interaction with the space around them and their proximity to the listener. Very rarely do I hear orchestral images stretch this far back behind the speakers. It's also really a treat to feel like you are listening to the interactions of the space around you. And I mean that in terms of the space the recording was captured. It almost felt like I was sitting in the temple and I was hearing, oh, there's this big cavernous space over here, and I hear that in my soundstage in my listening room. When Bud Herseth sings those glorious first trumpet notes in the opening promenade of the piece, you really sense the interaction of that sound, mainly the side reflections that occur before it reaches you in this large hall that was empty for the recording. When the orchestra comes in, particularly with this big force and energy in Gnome, the first miniature, the sense of just how massive this collection of musicians are in front of you, it's staggering. It's something I've only heard big speakers accomplish. I don't care how many subwoofers you have. I cannot recall ever hearing this type of scale from smaller boxes. But this is also a very detailed and revealing recording, and that means it could get a little hot up top, particularly when the trumpets and strings and percussion are all kind of really giving it their all. You know, get to the finale, the Great Gate of Kiev, caused me to kind of just turn down the volume a few times because things were just getting a little too intense for my musician ears. For listeners used to Metal Dome tweeters, this may be the experience you crave, but I have to admit that for my taste and what I'm used to, mainly soft dome or ribbon tweeters, this setup can sound a little bit fatiguing if you're into longer listening sessions, and I had to break up my listening time more often than usual. I think this might also have to do with just how comparatively low the speaker's tweeter rolls off. Clearly, there was a design reason for that crossover spec, but for me, that design choice contributed to a treble that in many ways wanted to be the star of the show. Don't get me wrong, it's really glorious. If you love Focal, Rockport, Bowers & Wilkins, speakers like that really show you the detail of the treble and have that zing to them, this is going to be right up your alley. It's right up in with that sound signature. Before I sum things up, I want to go over a few interesting quirks I noticed about the Krypton3X. For one, this speaker has some of the best subjective off-axis response I've ever heard. Normally, I'm very concerned with where my listening position is, where I'm located to get the optimal experience of soundstage. With the Krypton, it sounded good no matter where I sat. It's a great choice if you like to have people over for listening parties or if you like to move around your room while you're listening to music. It's very easy to have a large sweet spot, I think, with this speaker. One negative quirk, besides the size and weight, which is going to come with any speaker, any big full-range speaker like this, is just how difficult it is to get the mid-range grills off. Because this speaker comes with protective grills over the mid-range and also over the side on the woofer. The side, easy to get off, but the mid-range, I almost considered leaving them on for this review simply because of how much it hurt my hands to try and remove the metal driver guards, the mid-range driver guards. In my opinion, this is something Amphion they should provide either a tool or at the very least some instructions for, because it took a good deal of time, effort, and some pain and marks on my fingers. Look, getting back to the core issues of this speaker, the Amphion Krypton3X is a very big, very expensive full-range loudspeaker, and any good review has to be honest about that fact. Also, as well as the fact that that isn't such a rare thing anymore. In fact, the world of high-end audio is at present not concerned with $30,000 speakers, it's concerned with $300,000 loudspeakers. A $30,000 loudspeaker, well, that's just cute to that certain portion of the industry. But it's not cute to me. I take this kind of money seriously, and fortunately the Amphion is a serious speaker with serious design behind it. One of the things I admire most about this speaker is how bold its design choices are, from the crossover to the driver engineering to the form factor, the waveguide, the side woofer placement. Everything here marks a serious attempt by Amphion to make their product truly reference quality, high-end, and compatible with the most amount of listening spaces possible. Through the Krypton3X, Amphion have demonstrated a product that does many of the things you want from an ultra high-end design. Scale and soundstage on this speaker are massive. In fact, a few weeks ago, I had a longtime friend over. He's actually a speaker cabinet maker. And I had him over here to listen to the new room and the Amphions. He's listened to various different iterations of my system over the years. And after he sat down, we played one song. The first thing he said was, "Dude, your soundstage is huge." Is someone that enjoys orchestral music that has perhaps 60 to 100 people on a stage, I take that fact seriously. I also enjoy the dynamic agility of the Krypton3X, particularly how it can trick you into relaxation and then jolt you awake with scale and energy. Its transparency can be a double-edged sword, showing you wonderful colors on the best recordings and all of the disappointing shortfalls of the less than best. It's kind of like gearing up for a romantic evening by replacing all of your bulbs with 6500 Kelvin LEDs. It might flatter some, but most will wind up feeling disappointed. It was that way with many of my guitar-centric recordings. The kind of speaker that loves distorted electric guitar is the speaker that often has a bit of a boost in the mid-range, the frequency response. And the Krypton3X, it doesn't have that quality. You will hear every single detail and every pedal in the chain, but you're not gonna feel it the same way you might with other designs. Now, acoustic music, on the other hand, mostly benefited from this open and unencumbered sound. Listen, for those chasing the high end that want that transparency, that like all that, everything that a metal dome tweeter can reveal, this speaker might divert your gaze from some of the older house name brands to a boutique finish option like this one. I really enjoyed my time with the Krypton3X because the Krypton3X opened new sonic doors that I may have never experienced in my personal hi-fi system. If you have often wondered if your space is acoustically enough for a full-range reference loudspeaker, I'd encourage you to give the Kryptons a demo because they might test that assumption. But those are just my thoughts, and we of course would love to hear yours. Please leave a comment down below, and don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons so that more audiophile content from myself and from the Absolute Sound team show up right in your feed. I'm Michael Johnson, and I'll see you all in the next review.